is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalohungba. Here are the headlines for Friday, November 6th. Native candidates are celebrating milestones in races for state legislatures and Supreme Courts. Here's our final end-of-the-week wrap-up of election 2020. 14 Natives ran for the U.S. House and Senate, while many more were looking to leave an impact on the state and local levels. Wyoming featured 2 Northern Arapaho candidates who ran against each other for a state House seat. Republican Valeria Whiteman lost to Democratic incumbent Andy Clifford. Ponca Victors, who is Thona Optum and Ponca, won her 6th term to the state house in Kansas. And Democrat Gabrielle Caceres Kelly won her race for Pima County Recorder in southern Arizona. The Tucson mayor tweeted her congratulations, calling Caceres Kelly the first Indigenous person to be elected to a countywide office in Pima County. Across Indian country, Natives made their way to the polls in various modes of transportation. In White River, Arizona, on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, Apache crown dancers led voters to the polls. And in Nevada, ballots were carried by horseback. The Native American Rights Fund helped secure the right of third-party organizations to collect ballots and deliver them to election offices. On the Yamba Shoshone Reservation, Louis Afraid of Hawk, Rusty Brady, and Daniel Hooper picked up ballots from tribal members and delivered them to Tonopah, which is too far for many who don't have good transportation. And in Wisconsin, Greg Johnson from Lac du Flambeau encouraged voters to Skoden to vote. This election had a record number of voters. Elections were also held in Bolivia. Supporters of the MAS party, which has deep roots in the country's indigenous population, celebrated the presidential election victory. President Luis Arce won the general election on October 23rd, and supporters gathered on Saturday to celebrate the victory with him. One supporter says she's grateful for the Bolivian people because thanks to them, the people are back in power and can feel protected. Bolivia had an 88% voter participation, according to election officials. It was the second highest in the country's history. Arce won 55% of the votes against 6 rivals on the ballot. He will be inaugurated on November 8th. The Shinnecock people in New York are holding an occupation to assert their sovereignty. Sovereignty Camp 2020 occupiers are urging the state to drop a lawsuit against an electronic billboard, which they refer to as a monument and say represents the tribe's sovereignty. It's one of the few revenue streams the tribe has, and it was actually used to help get out vital coronavirus information to all people there this summer. Organizers are now demanding Governor Andrew Cuomo and the Attorney General drop what they call a baseless lawsuit against the nation over its monument. Grandmothers like Rebecca Genia are at the month-long occupation because they say they are tired of ancestral lands and ancestors being desecrated, and they say the housing crisis is making people sick.
You know, it was deliberate to shove us over here and to forget about us. Americans on land, and they can also play golf on our desecrated graves, you know, while we sit here sick and poor, and, you know, they look down on us, and so much racism and, of course, tribal poverty. It's a mess. So yeah, it's really runs deep.
This November marks the 30th anniversary of Native American Heritage Month. It began as a push by Seneca citizen and acclaimed archaeologist Arthur Parker for a single day of national commemoration for Native Americans. It has evolved into a month-long celebration of Native heritage and contemporary culture. In the past, in-person events included Indigenous dancing and singing, as well as speakers, but because of the coronavirus this year, most events will be held virtually. You can share your video and photos of Native heritage events with us on any of our social media platforms. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today for Friday, November 6th. I'm Patty Thalohungba. When we come back, it's our Reporter Roundtable. And yes, we'll be talking about the elections and the wait for the ballots as they are being counted. As we wrap up election week and break down the results so far, we are joined by two journalists who can help us with this conversation. Dana Hedgpeth is a reporter with the Washington Post. Welcome, Dana.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Savannah Maher is a reporter with Wyoming Public Radio. Welcome, Savannah.
Thanks, Patty.
And before we start our conversation, let's take a look at the native vote and its impact on swing states. Our national correspondent, Mariannette Pember, spoke to several native groups ahead of the election.
O.J. Siemens of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, a Native American voting rights advocacy education group, gives us the definition of a swing state.
Basically, what a swing state is that the percentage of votes is so narrow that by the people turning out, it could swing the vote one way or another.
So what states are we seeing in this election that are swing states?
Well, first, Arizona, and then you have Minnesota, and then you have Wisconsin, and then you have Michigan, you have North Carolina, and you have Nevada, and you also can throw in there Colorado. But if you took and looked at the election in 2016, what you will find is that whichever presidential candidate, whether it's Hillary Clinton or President Trump, whatever amount of vote that they won those states by, the native vote equaled or surpassed that number.
Guy Ryder of the Menominee Tribe is executive director of Minneconnicum Incorporated, a grassroots organization based on the Menominee Reservation in northeastern Wisconsin that is working to revitalize their community.
Wisconsin is a swing state. Can you tell me, are people pretty aware of that?
I think so. I think it's getting, more and more aware, especially as we're getting so very close to the election time. And, Trump won vote in 2016 here by 0.7%, but the native vote is like 1.4% here.
Oh, wow.
And, we could very well swing that whole election.
What are the issues, that you think that people, native folks in Wisconsin are really concerned about?
Yeah, I think from what I'm hearing a lot is environmental. In Wisconsin, that isn't fighting some sort of environmental threat, or at least that's, close to them.
Are you seeing greater interest this election cycle than in the past?
Yeah, I do. I definitely see it, especially a lot of the younger people, the newer voters, seeing the opportunity that we have here as Indigenous people.
Next, we go to Arizona, another swing state, to speak with Maria Dadger, executive director of the Intertribal Council of Arizona.
As tribal nations, as sovereign nations, most of the things that happen for us within our communities rely on the federal government. And so we have a chance to impact those policies by our vote. In Arizona, we have 22 tribal nations. We're in the top 10 as far as states of having the highest population of Native Americans in the United States.
What are the issues for Native people in Arizona?
We really have a strong interest in access to education and educational opportunities. Environmental quality is a huge issue for tribes.
According to the newly released Indigenous Futures Survey, Native people are engaged in the political process more than ever. Professor Ariane Eason of the University of California, Berkeley, one of the survey's researchers, discusses findings.
One of the biggest top-line takeaways from our findings is really that Native people are really engaged in the political process.
Did you find anything that might reflect or predict, Native people's participation in this presidential election?
We saw really high rates of engagement. So, that being said, there were still a lot of barriers that Indigenous people were facing. And some of it is really access to polling places. At the same time, we see that people really are taking very seriously what's going on. And so when we look at what motivates people to vote, what people are really caring about is candidates' platforms and their track record on Native and tribal issues.
In Cincinnati, Mariannette Pember, Indian Country Today.
So swing states and the native vote, how is this impacting the presidential election, Dana?
Well, it's been very important. Never before have swing states played such a crucial role. Pre-election, and then now we're still dealing with counts in some of these swing states. Georgia, Colorado, North Carolina, Arizona. We're still in the midst of all of this, and these are important states even before, and they're still remaining very important states.
And Savannah, what are you seeing when it comes to the native vote and impacting the presidential race? And then we'll get to other races, but for now, just the presidential race.
Sure. Well, I've been watching this morning, of course, what's going on in Arizona, and I saw that the Navajo Times reported that turnout is actually up in the counties that include the Navajo Nation and many other tribes, despite, compounding barriers to voting in those places because of the coronavirus. And we all saw earlier this week when CNN labeled the native vote something else on a graphic. And, Arizona is one place where the something else vote could really be making a pretty huge difference. So I think at the end of this, Democrats will have Black voters in places like Atlanta and Philly and Detroit to thank if Joe Biden wins this election. And they may also have Native voters to thank in places like Navajo County, Arizona, and Menominee County, Wisconsin.
And it's interesting too, because within the Navajo Nation, the president campaigned heavily for Joe Biden, but Vice President Myron Lizer of the Navajo Nation campaigned heavily for President Trump. So to see, even within one tribal nation, there are people supporting candidates on both sides. And Dana, we're looking at this even in Nevada here, and the native vote there is quite large as well, and they're still counting votes, and they're coming in. There was a great image that we showed earlier about natives coming in on horseback and delivering ballots, because so many people, as Savannah mentioned, have these barriers to voting that includes not having a vehicle to get to the polling place.
It's very true. There are incredible boundaries even before the coronavirus hit for those voting in Indian country. But I think what's different is the groups that have really pushed people to get out the vote. They've done a great job. They always do a great job every election, I think. But this election more so than others, they've really told folks, we really have to fight through this, whether you get there by safely, of course, wear your mask, social distance, but going by horseback, even my children, wow, that is so great to see Native Americans using their voices through any means to get there. Fascinating, great images to just show the native vote counts more so now than ever, both, especially for the presidential. How powerful can your vote be to count in the presidential election? Really get to make a voice heard, be seen. It's a powerful, powerful image, and I hope that it follows through to continue to get people to realize, hey, your voice really matters.
And Dana, with the election, so close, and of course, the Trump campaign filing a lot of suits in different states, it's kind of, in some ways, it is kind of reminiscent of the election in 2000, when the Supreme Court ended up having to decide that vote. Do you see any other comparisons?
It's really interesting. I went through this morning, and it changes so often, but we're up to at least 5 lawsuits in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Nevada, and the status of them keeps changing. It's all places where votes are either still being counted, and Trump is arguing, his team is arguing, interestingly, in places where they want the votes. Some places they want it stopped, or when it doesn't look like it's in his favor, and then other places they want them to keep counting. So which is it? You can't really have your cake and eat it too, but he's trying to. What's interesting is that this isn't the first time we've had elections that have felt like dragged out. I know many people have joked that this last week has felt like a year. Jumping back in history, in 1876, going way beyond the 2000 election, we had this historic wait of 4 months before it was decided between the Republican Hayes and the Democrat Tilden. And in fact, they didn't even decide it until 2 days before the inauguration. So talk about a long wait. Flash forward to 2000, we had the Bush-Gore. It seems now like even that was so long ago, but in reality, they waited about 36 days before the Supreme Court came down with the decision on that one. And even then, before the age of Twitter and email, we all had it so quickly, reporters came down the steps, and even Peter Jennings read it live on ABC News and sort of turned to his legal analyst to say, what does this mean? So it wasn't clear. Yeah. There's been stories and books written about how George W. Bush was called at home. He was in his pajamas reading, sort of got himself together, was told what it meant by one of his campaign managers, and then said, call the lawyers. I mean, these decisions don't come easily, and they certainly don't come fast. They take time. And the Washington Post today, we have a front page story about having patience, which, I have about that much patience. And I think humans by nature, we've all been pumped, right? We've been waiting for months for this. It's been a long campaign year. Then we get hit with this coronavirus. So I think people are just, it's tough to get much else done other than because we're constantly checking. We are used to the age of Instagram, Twitter, email. Look at us chatting via Zoom. This wouldn't have been possible in the 1800s. This was barely possible in 2000. They took a piece of paper down the Supreme Court steps. I was explaining this to my 8-year-old last night. She's like, why didn't they just email out the decision?
That's you
2000 to Patty and I wasn't that long
That's
ago.
great.
Our comparisons of these things do take time. Another thing, Patty, is you can't just pick your court or when you're not ahead, just say, oh, I want the Supreme Court to look at this. It doesn't work that way. You can't court shop. These things have to go through, there's a process. It has to go through appeals. Already we're seeing some pushbacks from these courts where they're saying, there's no, you also have to have evidence in a lawsuit, right? You can't just say, well, I think you're wrong. It doesn't work that way. And so far, there's not any hard evidence. Trump's folks have been on TV. They've filed in their briefings. There's evidence of allegations. But when it comes down to the actual proof, we're not seeing it. One of his spokespeople was on the other night talking about Pennsylvania, and their evidence was looking at these 59 districts. Well, in fact, people really dug deep on it. It turns out that these 59 districts are heavily Democratic, heavily African-American. The chances of, quote, Trump losing votes there, he probably wasn't getting any in the first place. So the fact to argue on a legal document like you lost votes, highly unlikely, but they've had really thin proof on this. So lawsuits probably aren't going to go up that. And the Supreme Court, it's not clear that they really want to get into a, Trump versus Biden case. Even though we've seen obviously a lot of things in the news, recent appointment of a new justice, it's not an area that the Supreme Court just wakes up and says, oh, let us weigh in. That's not how there's a process, there's a system for this, and that has to play out.
Well, it's a lot of interesting information here. And, the election of 1876, you pointed out, that actually had a record number of voters as well, and still holds the record for the number of voters. So even in this election, which had a high voter turnout, we still did not surpass the voter turnout of 1876. So that's, just interesting when we look at how many people have gone to the polls or sent in a mail-in ballot. Savannah, so in some cases, the native vote could have made a dent in the election, and but didn't. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I've been watching a couple of congressional races in my region in the Mountain West. And here in Wyoming, we had Lynette Grable, who is the first known Native person to run for federal office. She ran for our at-large House seat against Liz Cheney. And she lost by a wide margin. And so did a couple of other congressional candidates in this region. Paulette Jordan, who ran for a Senate seat in Idaho. Randy Soto, who ran for a House seat there. But I mean, one trend that I have noticed watching these candidates is they all did lose in these deep red states. They were all fighting an uphill battle, but they succeeded in bringing a lot of issues that are important to tribes to the table. Like, for example, here in Wyoming, during the House debate, we had Liz Cheney and Lynette Grable debating on issues like treaty rights and the impact of the pandemic on the Wind River Reservation, and Lynette Grable challenging Cheney's record on addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that was really big in a state like Wyoming. So, even though many of these candidates didn't succeed in this part of the country, their campaigns still made a big difference.
I think that's an important point to make, is that, again, that saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So by being at the table and being on the ticket, you're able to raise these kinds of issues that maybe other voters in the state are not aware of. So that's a big, I think, point to make, Savannah. So, and then also, how do you go up against a name like Cheney? Because her father, Dick Cheney, a former vice president, that must have been a pretty interesting campaign. And then again, in a pandemic.
Absolutely. And especially during a pandemic, I think, Lynette Grable came into this without a whole lot of name recognition outside of Fremont County, which is where the Wind River Reservation is. And it's hard to introduce yourself to voters when you can't hold events in person. But I will say it was pretty special to see just how much her candidacy energized voters on the Wind River Reservation. And also we had 4 Native candidates running for state house seats. 3 of them were running for the same seat. So only 2 of them made it into the state house, the 2 incumbents. But I think just having that many Native candidates on the ballot really got a lot of people excited and engaged. And there was a little uptick in voter turnout in the House district here that includes the Wind River Reservation. It was only a couple hundred, which doesn't sound like a lot, but this is a very rural part of the country. And I think organizers here feel like that was a success considering all of the barriers to voting this year with the virus.
Yeah, a very heated election, and then we have a global pandemic on top of that. It's just, it's going to be an election for the history books for sure. Let's talk a little bit about the new makeup of the new Congress here, because again, we had 6 not Native American, but 6 indigenous people who won their election. So now we have, we had the 4 for a long time, but now there are 2 new people who have been elected to Congress. How do you see that changing votes when it comes to issues important to indigenous people, Dana?
Look, that is incredible because, again, Native voice, the hashtag Native voice, that wasn't around even just 4 years ago. We have so many ways now to get out the word, to get Natives involved. And as Savannah said, even if folks lose, it still sends a message, right, to current generations, to children that are watching. Look at these leaders at a time when this country needs leadership. We can all agree on that. There's nothing better than to have Native children of all ages and young adults, and even those of us who've been around for a while, to say, hey, this is refreshing. Yes, there's winners and losers in every battle, but we were at the table, the names got out there, and those who succeeded, fantastic. Now the pressure will be on them. Washington's a big town. This is not a town. You need to come in here proud. You need to come in here and make a difference. Bring up your issues. You're dealing with the mainstream population that doesn't know you as well. They have an uphill battle, but I think they're up to it. Look, they got through running a campaign, even in good times, is a tough challenge. Plop on top of that, a pandemic. These folks are not light in their boots. They know how to walk into a room. They know how to get attention. They're going to surround themselves, I think, with good, smart people. They wouldn't have made it this far and won. It is a big deal to have them at the table. There are opportunities to bring up everything from environment, education, health. Obviously, these are going to be big issues. They're going to be faced with colleagues who maybe have never heard of where they're from. It's such a great opportunity. We all will be watching to see, even if they don't win the issue per se for Indian country, the fact that they brought it up to the table, you have to start it somewhere, right? There's still people in Washington who scratch their heads when you say Indian country. So just the awareness alone should not get lost in the battle. You don't have to always win the fight. Sometimes you've just done a great service to your people by bringing up and fighting a good, clean fight of raising your issues.
Well, so Tom Cole, Representative Cole from Oklahoma, who's been serving now, I think just got elected to his 10th term here. So he's been in Congress for all of this time, alongside Mark Wayne Mullen and, of course, Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland also won their reelection. So now they're veterans, right? Going into their 2nd term. And is it too early to start talking about the midterm elections, Savannah?
It's funny. I was just talking with Aaliyah Chavez of Indian Country Today about this the other day for Wyoming Public Radio. And we were talking about just how quickly 2020 passed us by and how it's probably not too early to start thinking about 2022. And she mentioned that she expects a lot of young people to be stepping up in the midterms. We saw a lot of young Native people running for office this time around. And yeah, it'll be very interesting to see who turns out in 2022.
And Dana, what about you in terms of looking at, looking at the incumbent? It seems like the midterms are traditionally not good for whoever is in the White House, whoever won the election. And midterms tend to be their time when voters decide they don't like what they're doing. They're not, maybe patient to see how their full term will turn out. So midterms can be very tricky.
They're a tough time, Patty. And already this election cycle has been like no other that most of us have seen. So it is going to be incredible pressure for whoever gets in the White House and for those who are in Congress to say, hey, what have you done for us? People's, I think, expectations are very high. They want to see results. We've had a rough year, as Savannah says. In some ways, this year has flown by, and other times days feel like weeks, right? But people are watching, they're attuned. They want to see, what have you done for me? And they're going to have to really answer and move quickly. We don't have really time to fool around.
And it's a good way to end it there because we are out of time. Dana Hedgpeth with the Washington Post, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Savannah Maher with Wyoming Public Radio. Thank you, Savannah.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. On behalf of our entire crew here at Indian Country Today, have a great weekend. And remember, take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalhungba. Join us again on Monday.
You got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.